Ukraine continues to be Schrodinger's war, as I like to call it. And I call it that because it seems like there's so many narratives, even from the same person or the same publication or the same government, that can be within the same article or different article in the same day that are all mutually exclusive and contradict one another, that it can be exceedingly difficult to know what's even going on. What version of reality we're supposed to believe. And it's rough because a lot of them are mutually exclusive. A lot of them can't both be true at the same time, but they're coming from the same person. And hence, I call it Schrodinger's war, where you have two opposite things that are both simultaneously true and simultaneously false. And that can kind of summarize the entirety of the narrative at this point in time. Russia is completely stalled out. They're facing domestic uh, collapse at home politically. The Russian people are deserting the army. The economy's gone into free fall. I've also heard people say that the Russian economy is actually better off now than it was prior to the war, and that this has actually strengthened the Russian economy. I've heard Russia has like hundreds of thousands of troops surrounding Ukraine, ready for a new offensive. I've heard, if you believe a lot of the Western sources, Russia's losing like 900 people a day. The Wagner organization's lost 40,000 casualties. I, I think it was four. It was like no, I think it was 40 or 6. Yeah, it was 40 out of 50,000. I forget the exact amount, but it came out to like 70 to 80% of its total manpower is apparently all dead in the Battle of Bakhmut, but they're still somehow able to lead. We hear Ukraine's going to get tanks, it's going to get heavy weapon systems, it's going to get fighter jets, but then you also hear people saying Ukraine's not going to get anything. There's nothing left to send, and you do kind of get all these different narratives. And I don't know if you can really make that much out of it. Certainly, it does seem that Bakhmut is going to fall sooner or later. I haven't heard anything in a while out of Western sources that Russia is failing to capture it or they aren't making progress. I'm hearing a lot of people say that it's not strategically important, it's not significant, that Russia's wasting manpower on this worthless target, but I haven't really seen anybody say that it's about to fall to come back under Ukrainian control, and the Ukrainians will push them back into Donetsk. I've also seen some people say that I think it was the Pentagon who said the idea of retaking Crimea is just not going to happen. Ukraine is not going to have the resources for it. Because Zelensky has said in the past that giving back Crimea and paying war reparations is a precondition to any kind of negotiated peace. And Russia's never going to give Crimea back, and I don't know how realistically Ukraine thinks that it would take it back. I'm guessing it's just rhetoric, but I'm just kind of trying to be real here. But yeah, so we don't know the exact situation on the battlefield. The casualty numbers are a work of fiction on both sides. And people have accused me of just using pro Russian sources and kind of being in the bag for a lot of these people. And I will admit, the main ones I tend to watch is the Duran and the New Atlas. And they're both obviously very pro Russian sources. But I also obviously am exposed to a lot of Western media. And the sources I do watch, most of their actual reporting, if you read between the lines of when they're offering kind of commentary, is them reading like Wall Street Journal articles or Washington Times or Financial Post, or just reading direct statements that have been made by the Department of Defense or something. So unless we're going to go with the fact that like the U.S. government's official aid statements are complete fabrications that are created by like pro-Russian hackers or something, I do think there is at least a little bit that we have to go on in this scenario. And that's probably the best thing that we can focus on at this point in time is what is the logistical situation on the ground like? Is Ukraine getting the weapons? I had somebody, maybe this is salty of me, say the recent post that I view this war like command and conquer, and I don't understand how modern warfare works. And I'm not a military guy, but I don't think it's like a strange RTS gamer idea that the side that has a vast advantage in terms of firepower has an advantage. I don't think that's a very controversial statement. And most of what I've seen is that so the claim is Russia's running out of ammunition. I don't know if that's true or not. I don't know if it's um, Russia's scaled it back to whatever the level that they can sustain over the long term is. I don't know if it's because they aren't launching major wide front offensives, they don't need to use as much. But generally speaking, the numbers I've been seeing is Russia's been using roughly 3 to 5 times as many shells a day as Ukraine. I've seen that go as high as 6 or 7, and I've seen that go as low as like 3. But I haven't seen any source that doesn't say that Russia isn't using a massive, like a way more shells per day than the Ukraine is, and that's coming out of both pro-Russian and pro-Ukraine sources. Also, if you start to look at the actual aid deliveries, there'll be something like 30,000 shells or something, which is like less than a week of what Ukraine needs to maintain their vastly depleted rate of artillery fire, and they'll get something like 30,000 normal artillery shells once a month from the US and a smaller amount from other NATO countries, combined with whatever they can produce themselves and whatever they have left in their stocks, which I would imagine is very little. Also, if you look at like the actual number of things that are being sent to them, it's like 200, 300 tow missiles, 200, 300 javelins. And once again, if you look at like the new Atlas, and once again, I get that he's extremely pro Russia, but he cites a study that the US Army did that found that I think it was, I forget if it was tow missiles or javelins, only have about a 20% at best hit rate by trained US soldiers under training conditions, which sounds pretty reasonable to me. I mean, the actual likelihood of hitting somebody with any weapon system, let alone doing it semi-reliably, is pretty low. Like it took thousands, if not tens of thousands, of flak shells in World War II to even hit a bomber. If it was flying over a city, the flak was more there to just kind of mess up their formation than to actually try to kill anything. I'm sure that more people probably died from the flak shells and the flak fragments crashing to the ground than it actually prevented in terms of shooting bombers down. But the point is this: if you look at the accuracy rates of a lot of these things under ideal US training conditions, I'm willing to believe them. But this is in war, and we can say the US Army is very well trained and very well disciplined, and they could probably obtain something somewhat similar to training conditions. Okay, I'm willing to give them that. If they've rehearsed it properly, there's no reason why they can't. It's definitely going to be harder, but not. We'll give them that. But the Ukrainians haven't been trained on a lot of this stuff, and if they have been trained, it's how like the bare minimum of how to use it. If they were to get Abrams tanks or Leopard 2s or any of this stuff tomorrow, you might be able to train the people to like drive the tank around and fire the gun in a couple weeks, but to make usage of its quirks, to properly maintain it, to not do stuff that like destroys the engine, to fully understand the electronics in it. There's also the question of like, does the electronics within the Abrams work with all their other stuff? The like fully integrated weapon system takes years, perhaps up to a decade. It takes a very long time. And truth be told, is the Abrams probably the best tank in the world at this point? Yeah, I'd say so. Tanks that exist in any significant numbers. The Abrams is probably. I'm not sure if the T-14 Armada is better. I don't know how many of them were actually produced and if they've actually been tested in combat, but it is probably in the top 3 best tanks in the world. Is it better than probably the T-80s or T-90s that the Russians have? I don't doubt it. But the question is, how much better is it? Is like 30 Abrams or whatever they would wind up getting in whatever the phases are, is that equivalent to like 200 T90s? I don't think so. Maybe 30 Abrams could take on at best. I'm just making up numbers here, but you get my point. 100 T90s, but it's just not enough. And there is the obvious and logistical things. You need completely different tools to work on an Abrams. You need people who are trained with the electronics, the guns. It needs its own ammo. Challenger 2s have their own ammo, their own spare parts. Maybe some of this is interchangeable, but I imagine a lot of it isn't. Who even knows if the Ukrainian? I think the Abrams can take any type of fuel, but I'm not even sure if the other tanks use the same type of fuel as the Ukrainian ones do. And they're going to have these completely different logistical systems for each one, and they're not really enough to make a difference. And you heard them talking about giving the Ukraine fighter jets. Well, they aren't going to send Ukraine enough fighter jets in time for it to make any kind of difference. So now I think they're pulling back on it. But if you think tanks are complicated, I mean, at the tank, at least you could maybe make the argument you could use it as some sort of an assault gun that people could get into the Leopard 2. They could drive it around. They could maybe use the thermo optics and the targeting computer and just use it to blow things up. You could probably make at least some use of it, even if it's not really as effective as the Soviet tanks that the Ukrainians were using. But what are you supposed to do with a fighter jet? Those things, once again, years and years, and the US's break all the time, and they require absurd amounts of maintenance. And the F-35 debacle is still going on, and it's like the expectation is that's going to work. It also is assuming, once again, once we get into this whole conversation about weapons, like, so the assumption is Russia doesn't have any of these things. Russia has like no main battle tanks. It has no missiles. They don't have cruise missiles. They don't have ballistic missiles. They don't have anti-tank weapons. They don't have GPS guided bombs or whatever the other fancy things are. The assumption is Russia has none of these things. And the only power in this that has them is Ukraine through the US. There's also kind of the issue of, so the Ukraine has a couple hundred of the specific type of anti-tank missile. Russia probably has thousands, if not tens of thousands, of something that's, well, not quite as good, is somewhat comparable. So someone I was reading a book a while back. I forget which book it was exactly, but they were talking about the Soviet military doctrine. And a lot of people like to shit on the Soviet military doctrine and say, oh, it was just human wave tactics. They didn't put any of thought or technology into their stuff. The T-80s were nowhere near, or the T-74s or whatever, were nowhere near as good as the M1 Abrams. Their jets weren't as good. Their units weren't as well trained. They relied on numbers. The Soviet calculation wasn't so much that those weapon systems weren't good. I mean, they have their own elite special forces. They have the Spetsnaz, they have guard divisions, that kind of thing. But the Soviet assumption was that in the face of an industrial war, in the face of a total war, all those, like, relying on delicate, limited numbers of systems that cannot be easily repaired or replaced is just not going to last very long. And it's kind of funny because I've been watching Binkov's Battlefield for years now. And something that always came to mind whenever he was doing these verses is the more advanced militaries would run out of weapons in like a week. And maybe that's an exaggeration, but not by much. Especially when you do the historical ones, like could modern Germany stop D-Day? And modern Germany couldn't stop D-Day because it just ran out of missiles. It didn't have nearly enough to fight a war on that scale. And I have seen people say that, well, the U.S. Army isn't designed that way. The NATO armies aren't really designed that way. And that kind of opens up like another bunch of questions. Like, I'm guessing the U.S. retired a lot of this stuff from the Cold War, and maybe they retired and they decommissioned a lot of their shells and ammunition. But, like, realistically, what were they expecting to have happen if they went to war with Russia? Were they just going to use nukes? Did they expect that just their air force would somehow be able to just take out the entire Russian ground army. I mean, they weren't able to provide Ukraine with an adequate amount of missiles and artillery shells and small arms ammunition to last for a year of fighting, which is probably small compared to what it might have been if the Cold War had gone hot. If they had have had their big Red Storm Rising or World in Conflict thing, would the U.S. have just run out of ammunition like 2 weeks in, and the whole thing would have been a disaster? What were they expecting to have happen if they went to war with China? They can't even really provide Ukraine with any of their advanced missile systems like ATACMS, or I think they're running short on javelins and all these other things. And if you look at it, they're like, we're going to up our production of this from like 50 to 150, and that's not even really an exaggeration for some of them, within 2 years. And Ukraine is going through like 40 of them a month and could go through way more of it than that. And it's like, once again, what was the US thinking? Like, when you look at how big its defense budget was, like it doesn't have ammo for its tanks, for its artillery, for a prolonged conflict. And once again, people will say, well, the US isn't designed to fight an industrial war anymore. They assumed that everything was about getting absurdly high kill ratios against people who had AKs and RPGs. Well, I mean, China, like, this is once again this bizarre narrative. It's like, okay, so the US isn't expecting to fight a conventional war except for against Iran or China or North Korea or Russia, all of which are countries that have substantial conventional militaries. Now, North Korea's army is completely obsolete, but I wouldn't be surprised if the US went to war with them and they ran out of ammo trying to blow up all those old, like, upgraded 1940s, 1950s tanks in like under a week. I mean, is that what they're gonna was that the plan? To use like $1 million missiles to destroy like upgraded T-34s? Like, it boggles the mind that this is the level of like thinking we're at. I remember, like, for one of the self-propelled artilleries, they're like, we're going to increase production of it from 15 to like 25 a year. It's like, it's nothing. And people laugh at Hitler for his wonder weapons, for wanting to build like 12 Mauses a month because the mouth was supposed to be a specialized breakthrough tank, to be used in a very limited context. So they only needed about a brigade of them. But people will laugh at that and say, what a waste of money. What a waste of money, like the Tiger 2 and all this other stuff is. But it's kind of a similar situation. It's just not enough. And it's not going to get there enough. And they have no way of expanding it. And as someone pointed out, okay, so let's pretend that this war drags on for like 3 more years. And the US is able to somehow convert a substantial portion of its civilian economy, even if it's a couple percentage points, into just producing weapons for Ukraine. Okay, let's go with that. Are we supposed to believe Russia has no way of scaling up its production either? That the Russian arms industry cannot expand at all. They can't increase the number of shells they're producing. They can't increase the number of missiles they're producing. That they can't do that quicker or more effectively than they. And once again, this goes back to what I was saying earlier, and I got a little bit distracted. But the Russians, like, when they were designing their stuff in the Cold War, they're like, look, it's better to have 10 tanks that are 7 out of 10 than 3 tanks that are 9 out of 10. We're not going to go full into like 100 tanks that are 1 out of 10 or something like what the Chinese army would do, but we're going to make something that's good, that's about as good as, like, using the example again, maybe like it's $100,000 per point out of 10 versus, so it's like, sorry, I'm kind of screwing this up. But let's say it's $1 million for a 7 out of 10 tank versus $3 million for a 9 out of 10 tank. Is the 9 out of 10 tank better? Yes, but it costs a lot more than the somewhat cheaper one that's perfectly functional. It's not like it's bad. It's not like its armor or its gun or its electronics aren't good. It's just not top of the line, amazing, great. And so we're supposed to buy that. Russia can't increase the production of any of these somewhat simpler weapon systems. And once again, Russia does have cruise missiles, it does have ballistic missiles, it does have guided munitions. It's not as if they do not have these things, and that they have no way of increasing production of any of this. That Russia is going to sit there for the next 2 years, not increase production, um, whereas the U.S. and Germany and everyone else is going to be able to ramp it up. And I mean, the more you look at it, like I said, the number of shells they're giving Ukraine and the number of missiles just keeps going down. And a lot of it now, if you look at the thing, says like that they're on back order. It's like, well, we're going to give Ukraine 30,000, like 100,000 shells when they're done in 3 months. Well, at the moment, you're having like Russia's not even attacking along the whole front. They can't even maintain their rate of artillery consumption, having just a couple major battles. Obviously, there's Bakhmut and Zaporozhye in the south, I think there is, and there's some fighting uh, in the southeast of the Kharkov region, I believe. But they can't even maintain their lines and match the Russians, or even really have a fraction of the Russian firepower at the moment. The U.S. doesn't have any more reserves to give them. Nobody has any more reserves to give them. And people will say, and I think correctly, the U.S. is holding back their most modern recent stuff. But then you get back to the original problem. Okay, you're keeping back your like $30 million missiles. What are you gonna do? Destroy like $1 million Chinese jet with like your $30 million missile that you could only produce like a couple hundred of a year? Is that an effective use of resources? What happens when those run out and you have no conventional weapons like left to rely on? And military history visualized, who um, are not pro Russia as far as I can determine, have said that the entire German armies, like that the German army announced this massive rearmament campaign. Basically, all of the money would have to go into purchasing ammunition to have it even functional as is, let alone buying or upgrading anything. They have no money to do that with. They don't even have enough money to buy ammunition. So, have I really talked that much about who's winning on the ground, what the lines are like, or anything like that? No, because I don't think we really can say anything definitive about that. There's two completely separate realities. I'm just going by what I know about the Russian war economy and the NATO war economy and what people have been saying and what's been promised to the Ukraine. It looks like they're scraping the bottom of the barrel. The reports I've heard out of the Ukraine is that they've started to kidnap people off the street using press gangs. Russia has not resorted to full conscription yet. Ukraine is having to continually decrease requirements, kind of like how a lot of the Entente and how the various great powers were in World War One, having to just keep decreasing requirements to join the army, drafting older and younger people. I don't think Russia's facing that. All the signs indicate that in an industrial war, Ukraine is losing, and it's going to be getting worse as time goes on. And maybe they will win some more battles, but I find it very hard to believe that Russia is losing 800 soldiers a day. Um, I think they claimed in Bakhmut alone, and Ukraine is not losing that many or more, despite Russia having like a 3 or 4 to 1 artillery advantage. I get that Russia's attacking, and I get that the defender, especially in urban combat, takes has a decisive advantage. But with such a massive advantage in terms of firepower, that should at least be kind of somewhat even, no? I don't know. Someone who knows more about it can maybe let me know, but I find it very hard to believe that Russia is losing manpower faster than the Ukraine does, when all indications are that Russia has better defended, better dug in positions, and has a massive advantage in both strategic and tactical firepower. That's my thoughts on the matter. I hope you found the video interesting. God bless. Let's hope that this whole war can just come to an end sooner rather than later, and whoever is left will actually bother to rebuild the country. Because I think we can all agree it's just a mess. So, anyways, hope you found that interesting. God bless everybody, and I'll talk to you again real soon.